If you have read Homer's Odyssey, written in 8th century BC, then you know that it is a kaleidoscope of characters. Gods, mortals, kings, and queens come and go as Odysseus journeys home to Ithaca after winning the Trojan War. Circe is one of Homer's many memorable characters. You may remember her as the Enchantress who turns Odysseus's men into pigs when they wander onto her island Aea. Described as the daughter of the god Helios and the nymph Circe, Circe plays a main role in only 2 of the 24 books of the Odyssey, and yet her identity has fascinated readers for centuries. Upon first glance, Circe appears to be that quintessential evil enchantress who uses spells, potions, and seduction to inflict suffering on her victims. You know the type. You've seen them in literature countless times before. She waves a long stick, adds a vile pinch of something magical to the food of Odysseus and his men, and inflicts a powerful enchantment with the incantation, quote, "Down in the sty and snore among the rest." The effect of Circe's food and drink is described as follows, quote, "Bodies, voices, heads, and bristles, all swinish now, though minds unchanged," unquote. However, Homer's depiction of Circe makes it impossible to cast her off as just an evil enchantress. His depiction implies that she has motives for her transformations. She curses trespassers, after all. He also highlights her fallibility and shows her to be capable of great kindness when she hosts Odysseus and his men for a year, sending them off on their journey with crucial advice. By leaving Circe's story so open-ended, Homer invites readers to interpret her according to their own understanding of the world. And indeed, countless authors from the Middle Ages through modern times have offered their own unique portrayals of Circe, each influenced by the prevailing concerns of their period. Over the course of literary history, Homer's Circe has become an enchantress with many faces. Authors who choose to include Circe in their work generally focus on one of 2 aspects of her identity, her enchantments or her seductive nature. Today, we will look at portrayals in which her identity as an enchantress plays the primary role. There are some authors, of course, who stick with the portrayal of Circe as that quintessential evil enchantress. Many brief allusions to her in early literature follow this pattern. Dante Alighieri's allusion to her in his 14th century Purgatorio is one example. Dante likens the political corruption of the cities in the valley of the Arno to Circe's transformation of men to pigs. In the conversation, Guido del Duca describes the people of these cities as so corrupted that, quote, "One would believe they fed in Circe's pen." Like Dante, William Shakespeare makes a negative allusion to Circe in Henry VI, Part 1. Referring to Joan, the rival of the English army, the Duke of York declares, quote, "See how the ugly witch doth bend her brows, as if with Circe she would change my shape," unquote. Though Joan is too complex a character to write off as purely a villain, the reference to Circe comes from the mouth of a character who intends to condemn Joan as evil, ugly, and unnatural. So this reference to Circe is absolutely drawing on audiences' recognition of her as a character to be feared for her supernatural powers. One prevailing interpretation of Circe is that she inflicts her enchantments on individuals who give in to temptations, such as sorcery or gluttony. In John Gower's late 14th century poem Confessio Amantis, Gower frames Ulysses and Circe's interactions as a test of Ulysses' virtues and thus his worthiness as a lover. As in the Odyssey, Gower's Circe fails to beguile Ulysses with her enchantments. For Gower's Ulysses, however, survival is not enough. He then uses his own powers of sorcery to gain control over Circe and takes advantage of his power by sleeping with her. Gower writes, quote, "And through the science of his art, he took of them so well his part that he begat Circe with child," unquote. As in Homer's epic, Circe's child grows up and mistakenly kills Ulysses, at which point the narrator delivers the moral of the story. Quote, "Through sorcery, his lust he won. Through sorcery, his woe began," unquote. In Gower's portrayal, Circe plays the role of evil sorceress, but she also serves as a test of virtue. And in doing so, becomes a victim herself, really. So this portrayal of Circe portrays her as both the villain and victim. And this kind of speaks to Gower's moral message. Hawthorne's short story, Circe's Palace, is a more straightforward example of this type of portrayal. Although he sticks very closely to the original storyline of the Odyssey, he makes several adaptations that shift the emphasis from Circe's power to the bestial behavior of the men. During their dinner with Circe, for instance, the didactic narrator observes the men and declares, quote, "All the gluttons and gormandizers, in the loftiest seats of dignity, on royal thrones, they could think of nothing but their greedy appetite," unquote. Likewise, he rewords Circe's incantation as follows, quote, "Assume your proper shapes, gormandizers, and be gone to the sty," unquote. Here, Circe is not forcing them into an unnatural shape, but rather changing them into the form that most naturally fits their behavior. Despite the shift in focus, Hawthorne does not stray far from the basic depiction of Circe as evil. He labels Circe's motive not as justice, but as the desire to tempt men to sin. Ulysses says to her at one point, quote, "Thou shalt do no more mischief in the world by tempting human beings into the vices which make beasts of them," unquote. In this moralistic presentation of this tale, Circe remains an evil-minded enchantress, regardless of the role she plays in delivering justice. As we move towards more contemporary times, we begin to see authors devoting full works to unraveling Circe's complexities. We also begin to see more sympathetic portrayals occur, particularly by women writers like Margaret Atwood and Madeline Miller. In Atwood's unique account of the men's transformation, Circe explains, quote, "I did not add the shaggy rugs, the tusked masks. They happened because I did not say anything," unquote. The poem goes on to imply, however, that she had the power to stop the transformation and chose not to. Quote, "I did not say anything. I sat and watched," unquote. Like Hawthorne, Atwood identifies the men themselves as the cause of their suffering, while maintaining that Circe played some role in the transformation. However, without a didactic narrator demanding that readers view Circe as the cause of the men's downfall, modern readers are more likely to view her decision not to interfere as just, since it is assumed the men brought it upon themselves. A feminist reader might go as far as to admire Circe for bringing to light the men's wrongdoings, rather than shielding the flaws of the male heroes, as many narrators do. Madeline Miller's feminist retelling of the Circe myth in her 2018 novel Circe is another sympathetic portrayal, though even more multifaceted. In this novel, which I highly recommend if you're looking for a beautifully written novel and a page turner, Circe is the main character. This allows Miller to go in depth in her exploration of her enchantments. In Miller's novel, Circe is first a means of self-discovery for a woman with low self-esteem. Describing the joy of succeeding at a new spell, she says, quote, "That was the moment I lived for, when it all came clear at last and the spell could sing with its pure note for me and me alone," unquote. Later, her enchantments become a means of self-preservation. When her instincts tell her that the men she has invited into her house will take advantage of her, a woman in a misogynistic society with no male guardian to defend her, she realizes immediately what she needs to do, quote, "In the kitchen, I put a hand to one of my drafts. You are being silly, I thought, but my fingers were already moving," unquote. Her instincts prove correct, and a heartbreaking scene takes place. Although Circe is undeniably a victim in Miller's novel, she is not idealized. As the story progresses, Miller writes that she develops a complicated desire to, quote, "see again their tearing flesh," unquote. In this way, Miller maintains Circe's reputation as a vengeant, frightening being, but her seemingly evil behavior can be understood by readers as a response to her brutal treatment at the hands of men. The fact that Miller is able to deliver this feminist retelling of the Odyssey without straying far from Homer's storyline and characterizations really speaks to the power of myth. When Miller looks at Circe's enchantments, she sees a symbol of feminine power and a weapon of self-defense. When Hawthorne looks at her enchantments, he sees a threat to Christian virtues. Some fear her, others sympathize. She has been assigned malicious motives and cast off as a negative example of femininity. And yet, in the hands of others, she has become the kind of heroine that motivates women to believe in themselves and to fight for the treatment they deserve. Her continuing appeal is evidenced by her appearance not only in literature, but also in DC Comics, in the young adult fiction of authors like Rick Riordan and Libba Bray, and even in the video games of Ensemble Studios and MOBA. If readers are looking for a character to fear, they're going to find it in Circe. If they're looking for a character to admire, they will find it in the same woman. Circe is not confined to the pages of Homer's ancient depiction, but is brought to life by each reader's unique beliefs and experiences. Thus, as the fears and desires of society change, so too do the many faces of Circe.